Chapter 1. The Rise of Osman from Tribe to Empire. In the vast and windswept steppes of Central Asia, the Kei tribe wandered as part of the larger Oghuz Turkic confederation, nomadic, fiercely loyal, and bonded by ancient codes of warrior honor. They did not yet dream of empire. Their lives were measured by the rhythm of the horse and the bow, the crackling of campfires, and tales whispered under the stars. These were not people of marble palaces or towering minarets, but of earth, sky, and sword. Yet within their bloodline lay the seed of a dynasty that would shake 3 continents. When the Mongol storm swept across Asia in the 13th century, many Turkic tribes were scattered like autumn leaves. The Kei, led by the seasoned Ertugrul Gazi, fled westward, riding ahead of destruction and into the turbulent heart of Anatolia. Their destination was not a chosen land but a land that chose them, a borderland between the decaying Byzantine frontier and the collapsing Seljuk Sultanate. Here, in a place called Söğüt, they found not just refuge but destiny. At the edge of 2 dying empires, the Kei settled as frontier warriors Gazi. Their lives were forged at the frontier, a liminal space where religions clashed, borders bled, and survival depended on both diplomacy and the blade. This land was not merely geography, it was the anvil on which the future would be hammered into form. While other tribes faded or bowed to larger forces, the Kei adapted, grew, and began to command attention. Osman, the son of Ertugrul, emerged as more than just a chieftain. He was a visionary. In the scattered world of post-Seljuk Anatolia, where rival beyliks jostled for territory and influence, Osman saw opportunity in chaos. Around 1280, he assumed leadership of the tribe, and with it, a new chapter in history began, one not of survival but of conquest. What distinguished Osman was not just his sword but his sense of timing and vision for unity in a fractured world. While many leaders pursued war for land, Osman understood the power of belief. He adopted the identity of a Gazi not merely as a title, but as a rallying cry, warrior of the faith. This notion carried immense weight on the frontiers, attracting not only fellow Turks but adventurers, zealots, and outcasts from across cultural boundaries. Under Osman's banner, religion and ambition entwined, creating a swelling tide of warriors hungry for both glory and divine reward. The famous Dream of Osman soon took root in legend, a dream in which a tree grew from his chest, its branches shading the world. Whether dream or later invention, it became the spiritual cornerstone of the Ottoman mythos. This tale gave his campaigns not just a political or military character, but a cosmic inevitability. Osman wasn't just a warlord. He was, in the eyes of many, chosen. Yet vision alone does not build empires. Osman displayed remarkable pragmatism in his dealings with the Byzantines. He forged alliances through marriage and treaties when advantageous, and struck with precision when weakness revealed itself. His first victories, modest but symbolically potent, were against Byzantine frontier towns like Bayezid and Inegöl. These were not just towns. They were stepping stones, experiments in governance, and statements of intent. By 1299, Osman made a daring declaration: independence. It was not announced with trumpets but carved into history through action. Breaking from the weakened Seljuk overlords, he established what would become the Ottoman polity. This was not yet an empire, but a flame had been kindled, and Osman held the torch. Central to Osman's strategy was the incorporation of diverse groups into his fold. Christian mercenaries, disgruntled peasants, exiled nobles, all found a place within the growing Ottoman force. Where others drew lines of purity, Osman built bridges of utility. His emerging principality became a magnet for the displaced and ambitious, offering them not just a banner, but purpose. As victories accumulated, Osman recognized the need for administrative evolution. He designated Yenisei as his administrative hub, a modest but critical act. A state was being born not merely through battle, but through the slow accumulation of civic infrastructure, tax systems, local governance, and an emerging bureaucracy. This transformation from nomadic chiefdom to proto-state marked a pivotal threshold. Unlike many medieval rulers who relied solely on brute force, Osman valued symbolic legitimacy. He aligned his rule with Islamic principles, portraying his expansion as a sacred duty. Mosques rose in newly conquered lands, not only as places of worship but as emblems of continuity and divine sanction. The Ottoman dream, therefore, was clothed not in the trappings of empire, but in the robes of religious righteousness. One of Osman's most ingenious innovations was his openness to cross-cultural alliances. Marrying into local dynasties, integrating Christian lords under his suzerainty, and respecting local traditions when useful, he proved that flexibility was as vital as fervor. The Ottoman machine was being engineered not to crush diversity, but to harness it. By the early 1300s, Osman's campaigns had not only expanded his territory but transformed the very identity of his people. They were no longer simply Turks or Ghazis or a migrating tribe, they were Ottomans. A new identity was coalescing, forged in the crucible of conflict, faith, and foresight. The siege of Bursa, begun during Osman's later years, symbolized the transition from raids to real conquest. Though Osman would die before its fall, the torch would pass seamlessly to his son, Orhan. Osman had done more than build a realm. He had carved a philosophy of rule, a flexible doctrine of expansion, and a dynastic legacy. Thus ended the life of a frontier chieftain, and began the life of an empire. Osman did not live to see the grandeur of the Ottomans at their height, but in his name they found identity. In his vision they found purpose, and in his dream they found destiny. The bow had been strung, the arrow loosed. The world would never be the same. Chapter 2: Expansion and Foundation, Orhan and the European Foothold. As the morning sun broke over the hills of Anatolia in 1326, the city of Bursa fell into Ottoman hands. Its surrender was not merely the conquest of a fortress, it marked a civilizational turning point. Under the leadership of Orhan Gazi, Osman's son, the Ottomans transitioned from frontier warriors into builders of a state. Bursa was chosen as the new capital, and its streets soon echoed with the sounds of commerce, prayer, and construction. Here, the empire would forge its first institutions, not only with the sword, but with pen, law, and coin. Orhan understood that military conquest was only half the battle. The real test lay in governance. He was no mere extension of his father's ambition. He was an architect of the Ottoman state. One of his earliest and most defining acts was the introduction of a standardized currency, the silver aki. It shimmered in the hands of merchants and soldiers alike, binding the fledgling realm through a common medium of exchange. With it came a predictable tax system, enabling the orderly collection of wealth and funding the next phase of expansion. Administration became Orhan's obsession. He created a centralized bureaucracy that could govern lands as diverse as marshy valleys and mountain strongholds. For the first time, Ottoman rule acquired a skeletal structure capable of supporting a growing empire. Islamic judges, or qadis, were stationed across the territory, resolving disputes and maintaining law. This dual commitment to Sharia and pragmatic governance became the empire's unique administrative fingerprint. But Orhan was not content with consolidation alone. His gaze turned toward the glittering cities still under Byzantine control. His ambitions would lead him not just deeper into Anatolia, but across the mighty Bosphorus into Europe. And as fate would have it, nature would open the gates. In 1354, a catastrophic earthquake shook the walls of Gallipoli, leaving the Byzantine garrison vulnerable. The Ottomans acted swiftly, seizing the port and establishing their first European foothold. It was a calculated risk, but one that would echo across centuries. This crossing into Europe was not just a geographical expansion, it was a psychological one. The Ottomans were no longer a local power. With Gallipoli under their control, the empire could project force into the Balkans and beyond. The heartlands of Christendom would never again know peace. Yet Orhan did not approach the Balkans as a foreigner. He saw it as soil ripe for the Ottoman blend of faith, governance, and military precision. The Janissaries emerged during Orhan's reign, not just as soldiers, but as a revolutionary force in military organization. They were Christian youths taken through the Devshirme system, converted to Islam, and trained from childhood to serve the Sultan alone. Unlike traditional tribal forces, the Janissaries had no loyalty to lineage or land. They were the shadow of the Sultan's will. Their loyalty, discipline, and skill would transform Ottoman warfare and symbolize the empire's evolving identity. Diverse, calculated, and relentless. Orhan's military strategy combined siegecraft, diplomacy, and selective force. He took Nicaea, Iznik, in 1331, a city rich in Byzantine symbolism and Christian heritage. Its fall was not just a military event, it was an ideological blow to Byzantine prestige. A city once central to Christianity's councils was now part of the Ottoman realm. Orhan respected its legacy but placed it firmly under the crescent moon. Further victories followed. By 1337, the port of Nicomedia, Izmit, had fallen. This gave the Ottomans access to the Sea of Marmara, opening trade and naval potential. With every conquest, Orhan did not merely take cities. He absorbed their administrators, artisans, and networks. The Ottomans weren't bulldozers of culture. They were weavers, integrating conquered lands into a grander imperial tapestry. Internally, Orhan's court began to reflect the sophistication of statehood. Scholars, poets, and architects gathered in Bursa. Madrasas educated future officials, while caravanserais supported traveling merchants. The empire no longer wore the wild garb of a borderland power. It now dressed itself in silk, script, and scholarship. Orhan presided over this transformation like a statesman and a shepherd, guiding his people from tribal roots into the maturity of monarchy. Religion remained central, yet the Ottomans showed remarkable tolerance for the age. Orthodox Christians under Ottoman rule retained autonomy in religious matters. Bishops were often kept in place, their churches respected. This calculated leniency did not stem from weakness. It stemmed from a deep understanding of statecraft. Better to rule a peaceful province than a smoldering ruin. Despite his political achievements, Orhan never neglected the sword. His sons were trained as warriors, leading their own campaigns, learning the brutal calculus of war. This generational continuity ensured the empire's heartbeat would not fade with the founder's death. His military elite, too, were seasoned, increasingly professional, and devoted not to local lords but to the Ottoman state. Perhaps Orhan's greatest legacy was intangible. He built faith. Faith not just in Islam but in the Ottoman system itself. By his death in 1362, the realm had doubled in size, crossed continents, and evolved from an ambitious tribe into a durable state. Roads now connected distant towns under one law. Silver coins passed from market to mosque. Soldiers wore uniforms, not tribal badges. And across the Bosphorus, Europe watched, nervously, as a new power rose from the east, one that would not be turned back. In the quiet of Bursa's mausoleum, where Orhan now rests beside his father Osman, lies the unspoken truth. An empire had taken root in Anatolian soil, but its branches were already reaching westward, across rivers, borders, and beliefs. The Ottomans had come to stay, not as guests but as heirs to history. Chapter 3: Murad I and the Balkan Strategy. When Murad I ascended the Ottoman throne in 1362, the empire was not yet an empire in the eyes of the world, but it was poised to become one. He inherited a realm freshly shaped by his grandfather's dreams and his father's statecraft, yet Murad saw something more in the horizon. He saw a realm not anchored solely in Anatolia, but straddling continents. Under his rule, the Ottoman gaze turned sharply westward, into the mountains, valleys, and blood-soaked soil of the Balkans. Murad's first active ambition was the capture of Adrianople in 1369, a city of immense strategic and symbolic value. Situated at the crossroads of Europe, it had served as a jewel in the Byzantine crown. Renaming it Edirne, Murad made it the new Ottoman capital, marking a definitive shift in the empire's center of gravity from Asia to Europe. It was not just a tactical move, it was a statement. The Ottomans were now a Balkan power. From Edirne, Murad orchestrated campaigns with ruthless precision. His soldiers, hardened from Anatolian conquests and bolstered by Balkan recruits, swept through Thrace and Macedonia. But Murad was no mere conqueror, he was a strategist of human minds. Where brute force risked resistance, he employed the politics of vassalage. Many Balkan lords were allowed to retain their positions in exchange for tribute and loyalty. It was conquest without endless war, a delicate dance of power and persuasion. To enforce this expanding dominion, Murad formalized and institutionalized the devshirme system. From Christian villages under Ottoman control, boys were collected and brought into the imperial fold. These children were converted to Islam, trained with military discipline, and groomed for service in the Janissary Corps or imperial administration. It was a system both feared and admired, one that transformed captives into the empire's sharpest weapons. Murad's Europe was a landscape of fractured principalities, crumbling alliances, and religious divides. He maneuvered through it like a chess master, exploiting old rivalries and sowing new ones. Rather than raise cities, he offered protection in exchange for submission. Orthodox Christians, Catholic Hungarians, Slavic nobles, all were drawn into the orbit of Ottoman diplomacy, seduced by the promise of survival beneath the crescent. But the sword still spoke. In 1371, at the Battle of Maritsa, a coalition of Serbian nobles attempted to push back against Ottoman incursions. They were met not by a tribal horde, but by an increasingly professional army, disciplined and deadly. The Ottoman victory was devastating. Maritsa's river ran red with the blood of knights and peasants alike. That battle silenced many would-be resistors and cemented Murad's dominion over the southern Balkans. Murad understood that warfare must be more than reaction. It must be anticipation. He began to divide his expanding empire into timars, military fiefs granted to cavalry officers in exchange for service. This system not only rewarded loyalty, but ensured that every conquest sowed the seeds of future defense. The Ottoman state was evolving into a living organism, each province a muscle, each soldier a sinew. Despite his outward strength, Murad moved with cautious wisdom. He knew the balance of fear and loyalty was delicate. He allowed Orthodox churches to function, monastic lands to remain untouched, and local customs to continue. For many under Ottoman rule, life changed little, save for the taxes. But these taxes came with roads, law, and order. Slowly, reluctantly, some came to prefer the Ottomans to their feuding native lords. Murad's greatest challenge came in 1389 at Kosovo, where a pan-Balkan coalition led by Prince Lazar of Serbia confronted the rising Ottoman tide. The Battle of Kosovo was not merely a military engagement. It was a crucible of myth, sacrifice, and empire. Armies clashed with primordial fury. Legends were born in blood and dust. In the chaos, a Serbian noble feigned surrender and assassinated Murad. The Sultan died not in a palace, but on the battlefield, his eyes filled with smoke and sky. Yet even in death, Murad's vision endured. His son, Bayezid, immediately took command, and Ottoman forces, though battered, held the field. The Serbian coalition was broken, its nobility decimated. The psychological impact was irreversible. The Ottomans had not only survived, they had won. Kosovo became the hinge on which Ottoman destiny turned. The Balkans, once a buffer, were now the empire's new frontier. Murad's reign marked a transformation deeper than mere conquests. Under him, the Ottomans shifted from a regional Turkish principality into a multi-ethnic, transcontinental empire. He left behind not just cities and titles, but systems. The devshirme, the janissaries, the timar grants, all would shape Ottoman identity for centuries. He was a ruler who carved the map not only with iron, but with institution. He understood that an empire must be more than its wars. It must be its roads, its schools, its laws, and its memory. Murad was not the last warrior king, but he was the first empire builder in full. His legacy was etched not just in stone or steel, but in the very bloodlines of Europe and Anatolia, now fused beneath a rising banner. Chapter 4: Bayezid I, the Lightning Conqueror and the Empire's First Crisis. When Bayezid I ascended to the Ottoman throne in 1389, moments after the dust of Kosovo had barely settled, he did so amid the smoke of battle and the weight of expectation. Unlike his cautious and calculating father, Murad I, Bayezid was a storm of ambition and urgency. His nickname, Yildirim, the Thunderbolt, was not merely poetic flourish. It was a prophecy fulfilled in steel, fire, and speed. In less than a decade, he would expand the empire's borders with breathtaking ferocity, only to bring it to the edge of ruin. Bayezid's military genius was unmistakable. He wasted no time after Kosovo, turning Serbia into a vassal state and immediately pressing into Bulgaria, where resistance crumbled before him. His campaigns were swift, ruthless, and relentless. Where others measured progress in years, Bayezid measured it in seasons. City after city fell either to the sword or to submission. By the mid-1390s, much of the Balkans had bowed to his authority or burned resisting it. Yet Bayezid was not content with European dominance alone. In Anatolia, the once fractured Turkish beyliks had begun to resurface in the wake of Murad's focus on the west. Bayezid returned east like a tempest, absorbing these rival principalities one by one. His consolidation of Anatolia was as brutal as it was effective, and by the end of the 1390s, he had unified nearly the entirety of Turkish lands under the Ottoman banner, a feat no sultan before him had accomplished. But it was Constantinople that haunted his thoughts. That glittering Byzantine bastion, still standing like a stubborn relic between Ottoman holdings, taunted Bayezid's imperial vision. In 1394, he laid siege to the city, encircling it in a blockade meant to starve it into submission. The siege would last for years, becoming a symbol of the Ottomans' rising threat to Christendom, and a rallying cry for European powers who feared a world swallowed by the Crescent. Europe responded. In 1396, the Pope declared a new crusade, and a coalition of knights, nobles, and kings marched to stop Bayezid. They met him at Nicopolis on the Danube. What followed was a cataclysm for the West. Bayezid's forces crushed the Crusaders with surgical precision. Many European nobles were captured, ransomed, or executed. The defeat sent tremors through European courts. It seemed the Ottoman tide was not just rising, it was unstoppable. Flush with victory, Bayezid began to carry himself as more than a sultan. He adopted the grandiose title Sultan of Rum, laying symbolic claim to the legacy of the Eastern Roman Empire. This was not only a political gesture, it was psychological warfare. He presented himself as the rightful heir to Byzantium, not merely its destroyer. It was a bold act of imperial theater that signaled the Ottomans' transition from frontier empire to global contender. Yet beneath the lightning lay the storm. Bayezid's relentless expansion came at a cost. His rule grew increasingly autocratic, his tolerance frayed, and his enemies multiplied. Among them was Timur Tamerlane, the Central Asian conqueror whose campaigns had left entire cities in ashes. The two empires were on a collision course, and Bayezid, rather than seek diplomacy, responded to Timur's provocations with defiance. The inevitable confrontation came in 1402 at the Battle of Ankara. The Ottomans, weary from ceaseless campaigns, met Timur's battle-hardened horsemen on the Anatolian plain. It was disaster. Timur's tactics outflanked and overwhelmed Bayezid's forces. The Sultan was captured, an emperor in chains. For the first time in their meteoric rise, the Ottomans had suffered not just defeat, but humiliation. The aftermath was chaos. The Ottoman Empire, so carefully constructed over decades, fractured overnight. Bayezid's sons, each governing different regions, turned on one another in a ruthless civil war. This period, known as the Interregnum, threatened to undo everything the dynasty had built. Provinces rebelled. Former vassals broke free. The empire stood on the precipice of annihilation. Bayezid died in captivity in 1403, a broken man whose vaulting ambition had brought both glory and devastation. Yet even in his fall, the empire did not collapse. His military reforms, his integration of Anatolia, and his projection of imperial power had laid foundations too deep to be completely uprooted. What emerged from the wreckage was a chastened but wiser Ottoman state, poised for rebirth. Bayezid's legacy is one of extremes, an emperor of dazzling conquests and shattering defeats. He was the thunderbolt that lit up the skies and scorched the earth, reminding the world that empires, like men, rise quickly, but can fall even faster. Still, it was in his storm that the Ottomans learned not only how to conquer, but how to survive. And survive they would. Chapter 5. The Ottoman Interregnum, Civil War and Recovery. The thunder that had echoed across continents under Bayezid fell silent in 1402, replaced by an eerie stillness. Timur's catastrophic victory at Ankara had not just shattered an army, it had decapitated an empire. The once mighty Ottoman state splintered as Bayezid's sons, Suleiman, Isa, Musa, and Mehmed, each claimed the fractured throne. What followed was not succession, but survival, and the empire descended into a fratricidal abyss that history would name the Interregnum. With no central authority, the Ottomans no longer looked like an empire but a collection of warring provinces. Each prince carved out his own dominion. Suleiman controlled the European territories, Isa held sway in western Anatolia, Musa camped in the Balkans, and the youngest, Mehmed, took root in the rugged heartlands of north-central Anatolia. Alliances shifted like sandstorms. Brother against brother, allies turned enemies, and former vassals reclaiming independence. The vacuum of power invited chaos. In Anatolia, many of the previously conquered Turkish beyliks, encouraged by Timur, reclaimed their autonomy. Cities that once bore the Ottoman standard now flew rival banners. The order imposed by Bayezid collapsed, and the once disciplined Ottoman military fractured into warbands, mercenaries, and regional militias. Governance was no longer a matter of statecraft, it was survival by the sword. Europe, too, seized the opportunity. In the Balkans, vassal states such as Serbia and Wallachia broke free, refusing tribute and raising local armies. Some sided with individual Ottoman princes, hoping to manipulate the outcome of the civil war to their favor. The Byzantines, long thought extinguished, regained breath, negotiating with rivals and offering sanctuary when it suited their goals. For a time, it appeared the Ottomans might dissolve into memory. In this maelstrom, Mehmed Çelebi stood apart. The youngest of Bayezid's sons, he was not the most powerful, but he was the most patient. He watched, waited, and consolidated. While his brothers exhausted resources and spilled blood, Mehmed built alliances in the shadows, offering peace where others demanded loyalty, and promise where others gave threats. He understood that reunification could not come through brute force alone, it required vision. Musa, once Mehmed's ally, turned on him and seized Edirne, challenging Suleiman's European stronghold. Their conflict culminated in Musa's short-lived reign in the Balkans. But it was Mehmed who saw the full board. In a stunning maneuver backed by the Byzantine Emperor Manuel II, Mehmed crossed into Europe and defeated Musa in 1413, ending the Interregnum. The Ottoman banner once again rose above Edirne, not in triumph, but in restoration. Mehmed I's coronation was not celebrated with parades or pageantry. It was met with weary relief. After a decade of chaos, the idea of unity had become as sacred as conquest. But the damage was deep. Infrastructure lay in ruin, the military was fragmented, and trust in the central authority had withered. Mehmed's first act as sultan was not expansion, but healing. He sought to reintegrate the rebellious Anatolian beyliks, not through subjugation, but diplomacy and promise. Some of these beyliks, now used to autonomy, resisted. Mehmed offered amnesty, marriage alliances, and positions of power. For those who refused, he responded with swift and precise campaigns. Gradually, the Ottoman heartland was restitched into coherence. In the Balkans, he employed the same strategy, reinstating vassalage over Serbia and Wallachia with careful pressure rather than overwhelming force. But even as he rebuilt, Mehmed reformed. He restored the Timar system, reaffirming land grants to loyal cavalrymen and re-establishing the economic backbone of the army. He revived the bureaucracy, reopened courts, and reconstructed trade routes that had been severed by war. His reign was not marked by dazzling conquests, but by the quiet hum of restoration. The empire, wounded but breathing, began to stir again. Mehmed's reign was also notable for its restraint. Unlike his father, he eschewed grand declarations or imperial theatrics. He governed as a caretaker, not a conqueror. Perhaps he understood that after fire, the soil must be cooled before it can grow. His restoration of Edirne as the capital, rather than an attempt to seize Constantinople or expand deep into Europe, spoke volumes of his priorities. Yet his achievements were not merely structural, they were symbolic. In restoring unity, Mehmed reaffirmed the very identity of the Ottoman state. The empire was no longer a loose confederation of beyliks. It was once again a singular entity with a vision. The scars of the Interregnum remained, but they hardened the state's resolve. The Ottomans had seen the brink of extinction, and they had returned. When Mehmed died in 1421, he left behind an empire mended, if not yet mighty. He was not the most feared of Ottoman sultans, nor the most celebrated. But without him, there would have been no empire for future sultans to inherit. In chaos, he planted stability. In division, he sowed unity. And in the ashes of war, he rekindled the flame of empire. Chapter 6: Murad II and the Return of Imperial Ambition. When Murad II ascended the Ottoman throne in 1421, he did so not as a conqueror, but as the son of a restorer. His father, Mehmed I, had painstakingly reunited the Ottoman realm after the chaos of the Interregnum. Now the task before Murad was not to repair, but to rise. He inherited a state stitched together by diplomacy and fragile truces, but its borders remained under pressure, and its rivals watched for weakness. Murad's reign would test whether the empire had truly healed, or whether its unity was but a thin veneer over festering divisions. The first test came almost immediately. The Byzantines, misjudging the young sultan's resolve, backed a pretender named Mustafa who claimed the Ottoman throne. With imperial ambitions of their own, they hoped to weaken the Ottomans once more by sparking civil strife. But Murad acted with unexpected decisiveness. He crushed the rebellion and forced the Byzantines back into their defensive posture. It was his first display of strength, and a warning that this was no puppet ruler. With internal threats contained, Murad turned his gaze once again to the Balkans. There, Ottoman control was tenuous. Vassals had grown defiant during the Interregnum, and Christian powers were beginning to stir. Murad launched campaigns into Serbia, Wallachia, and Albania, not with a goal of outright conquest, but to reassert suzerainty. His strategy was one of tightening control gradually, imposing tribute, placing garrisons, and installing loyalists in key towns. But it was not always enough. One name in particular would torment Murad's ambitions for years: Skanderbeg. The Albanian nobleman, once raised in the Ottoman court, broke from the empire and waged a fierce guerrilla war from the mountainous regions of his homeland. Skanderbeg's intimate knowledge of Ottoman tactics, combined with local support and European aid, made him a constant thorn in Murad's side. The Albanian resistance would remain unconquered throughout Murad's reign, a frustrating reminder of the empire's limits. Despite such setbacks, Murad secured major victories. In 1430, he defeated Wallachian forces, and his campaigns ensured steady Ottoman dominance across much of the Balkans. His generals became seasoned and his military infrastructure deepened, making the empire more capable of sustained conflict than ever before. But perhaps Murad's most astonishing act came not on the battlefield, but in the court. In 1444, he abdicated. In a move both baffling and profound, Murad voluntarily stepped down, handing power to his teenage son, Mehmed II. Perhaps it was fatigue, or perhaps he believed his son's rule would usher in a new era. But the world was not ready for Mehmed, and neither was Mehmed ready for the world. The timing could not have been worse. European powers, sensing an opportunity, launched a crusade to expel the Ottomans from Europe once and for all. Murad, called back to duty, reluctantly returned. What followed was the Battle of Varna, a clash between the Ottoman forces and a coalition led by Poland and Hungary. Murad, ever the experienced commander, unleashed his army with lethal precision. The Crusaders were routed. The Polish king was killed. The Ottoman banner stood unshaken. And Murad, having returned only to save the empire, resumed his position as sultan. After Varna, Murad focused on consolidation. He strengthened fortresses, reasserted administrative control over rebellious provinces, and deepened his grip on trade routes that stretched from the Aegean to the Black Sea. His court began to resemble the grandeur of earlier Islamic empires. Poets, scientists, and architects gathered, and the imperial presence was no longer merely feared, but admired. His reforms weren't limited to military and administration. Murad invested heavily in religious and educational institutions. Mosques were built not only as houses of worship but as symbols of permanence. Madrasas trained scholars who would shape the intellectual fabric of the empire. He understood that power needed to be both seen and felt, not only in war but in culture. Yet even in his later years, peace remained elusive. Skanderbeg's rebellion flared anew. Hungarian campaigns tested Ottoman defenses, and internal factions vied for favor. Murad fought not one enemy, but many, on hills, in courts, and across borders. And through it all, he ruled with a sense of duty sharpened by the lessons of his father's restoration and the memory of his own abdication. In 1451, Murad II died, having ruled for 30 years, interrupted only briefly by his experiment in succession. He left behind a state not just intact, but poised. The borders were secure, the armies were disciplined, and the capital stood as a center of trade, faith, and governance. But more than anything, he left behind a son. That son was no longer the untested boy of 1444. He was now Mehmed, matured by failure, fire, and foresight. And within him burned a vision, one that would eclipse even his forefathers. Murad's reign, defined by endurance and preservation, had laid the final stone upon which the future would rise. The Ottomans were ready not just to endure history, but to change it. Chapter 7. Mehmed the Conqueror, Fall of Constantinople. In 1451, the Ottoman throne passed once more to Mehmed II. But this was not the boy who had once held the reins for a brief and uncertain period. This was a different Mehmed, sharpened by loss, emboldened by ambition, and fueled by a vision far greater than any Ottoman before him. He did not seek to merely rule an empire. He sought to redefine its destiny. And in his eyes, that destiny gleamed from across the Bosphorus. Constantinople. The ancient city stood like a ghost of empires past, still proud behind its Theodosian walls, still whispering of Roman glory. It had resisted centuries of sieges, including his father's, and survived as a Christian outpost in an increasingly Islamic world. Mehmed saw it not just as a city, but as a crown, the symbolic heart of imperial legitimacy. This conquest would not merely complete the map. It would rewrite it. Mehmed's preparations were meticulous and terrifying in their scale. On the European side of the Bosphorus, he ordered the construction of the formidable Rumeli Hizari fortress. In just 4 months, it rose like a colossus above the strait, its cannons positioned to control all naval movement. It was a warning and a barrier, a physical chokehold that sealed off Constantinople from reinforcements by sea. But the Sultan's most devastating tool was forged not from iron alone, but from foreign genius. He commissioned a Hungarian engineer named Orhan to construct a cannon unlike anything the world had seen. The result was a monstrous bombard, capable of hurling 600-kilogram stone balls over a mile. It would become the battering ram of history, the fist that would knock down the walls of empires. On April 6, 1453, the siege began. For 53 days, Constantinople endured a storm of iron, fire, and fear. The sky was filled with smoke, and the earth trembled under the thunder of cannon blasts. Inside the city, Emperor Constantine XI rallied defenders with grim determination, though vastly outnumbered and cut off. Christians and Muslims fought, bled, and prayed as the walls cracked and hope thinned. But Mehmed was not simply throwing men at stone. He employed tactics drawn from across centuries: naval blockades, night assaults, psychological warfare. In one of the siege's most audacious moments, he transported ships overland on greased logs to bypass the chain blocking the Golden Horn. His fleet, overnight, appeared inside the harbor, shocking the Byzantines and tightening the noose. On May 29th, just before dawn, the final assault began. Waves of janissaries, Anatolian troops, and mercenaries surged against the weakened gates. For hours, blood ran down the stones. Then, at last, a small gate, the Kirkaporta, was breached. Through it, Ottoman forces poured in, overwhelming defenders and breaking centuries of resistance. Emperor Constantine XI fought to the last, disappearing into legend. By nightfall, Constantinople had fallen. The world changed that day. Eastern Rome, Byzantium, the last echo of antiquity, extinguished in one brutal morning. Mehmed rode into the city not as a barbarian, but as a ruler claiming his prize. He ordered the Hagia Sophia converted into a mosque, yet spared its structure and its legacy. Though some looting occurred, he reined it in quickly, signaling that this was not conquest for destruction, but transformation. Mehmed immediately set about rebuilding. Constantinople had suffered long decline and needed more than walls. It needed people. He repopulated the city by inviting Muslims, Christians, and Jews to settle there, offering incentives and protection. Artisans, scholars, and merchants returned. Mosques, markets, and madrasas bloomed alongside ancient cathedrals. The city was reborn, not as Constantinople but as Istanbul. The conquest sent shockwaves across Europe and Asia. The myth of Christian invincibility was shattered, and the Ottomans were now the undisputed masters of Southeast Europe. Yet Mehmed's vision extended beyond one city. With Istanbul as his new capital, he set out to eliminate the remaining Byzantine fragments and bring Anatolia fully under control. In 1461, Trebizond fell. The Empire of Rome had truly finally ended. Mehmed then looked to the Balkans. Serbia was absorbed in 1459, Morea in 1460. Albania resisted fiercely under Skanderbeg, but after his death, it too fell into Ottoman hands. Bosnia and Herzegovina followed. Campaign by campaign, Mehmed erased Christian strongholds, replaced them with garrisons, and folded them into his growing imperial structure. But conquest was not his only pursuit. He overhauled the legal system, issuing a codified law known as the Canoname, which supplemented Islamic law with imperial statutes. This created a dual legal structure, flexible yet orderly. Justice became a central feature of Ottoman rule, giving stability to a multi-ethnic, multi-religious population. Culturally, Istanbul flourished. The court became a center of poetry, philosophy, and science. Persian, Arabic, and Turkish scholars mingled in its schools. Libraries expanded, architectural projects multiplied, and the Ottoman style, blending Islamic, Persian, and Byzantine aesthetics, began to take shape. Mehmed wasn't just building cities. He was building civilization. In the east, the Ottomans extended influence into Crimea and challenged the remnants of the Karamanids. In the west, they brushed against the borders of Hungary and Venice, sparking skirmishes that would grow into future wars. Yet through it all, Mehmed ruled with cold intelligence, rarely swayed by emotion, always calculating the next move. By the time he died in 1481, Mehmed had doubled the size of the empire, established Istanbul as a thriving capital, and elevated the Ottomans from regional power to global force. He had claimed the dream his ancestors only whispered about, and reshaped the world to fit it. In his tomb beneath Istanbul, Mehmed rests as Fatih, the Conqueror. But his true conquest was not merely of a city. It was of legacy. He took a rising state and made it eternal. And in doing so, he did not close the book on empire. He opened its most glorious chapter. Chapter 8, Bayezid II, Diplomacy, Diversity, and the Quiet Empire. When Mehmed the Conqueror passed from the world in 1481, his legacy loomed like a mountain. His son Bayezid II emerged from the shadows of succession not as a firebrand warrior, but as a thoughtful administrator, steady, patient, and contemplative. Where Mehmed had torn down walls and redrawn borders, Bayezid sought to reinforce the frame of an empire that now stretched across 2 continents. His reign would not be one of thunderous conquests, but of quiet transformation, diplomacy, and cultural integration. Bayezid's ascent was not without strife. His younger brother Selim challenged his claim to the throne, plunging the empire into a brief but dangerous civil war. Selim fled west, ultimately falling into the hands of European powers, who used him as a pawn to pressure the Ottoman court. For years, his captivity in Rome and the intrigues surrounding his potential return remained a diplomatic headache. Yet Bayezid navigated the delicate situation with grace, paying tribute to keep Selim under watch, while avoiding direct confrontation with the papacy. With internal succession resolved, Bayezid turned inward. He understood that the conquest-driven momentum of his father could not be sustained indefinitely. The empire needed time to digest what it had consumed, to strengthen the sinews that held its vast territories together. He embarked on projects of infrastructure, commissioning bridges, caravanserais, aqueducts, and mosques, not as statements of might, but as arteries of unity. His vision was not expansion through war, but expansion through cohesion. A watershed moment in his reign came not through battle, but through mercy. In 1492, as the Spanish crown expelled thousands of Sephardic Jews during the Inquisition, Bayezid offered refuge. Ottoman ships were dispatched to collect the persecuted, and they were welcomed into cities like Salonika, Edirne, and Istanbul. Far from merely hosting refugees, Bayezid recognized their value. These were scholars, physicians, financiers, and craftsmen. Their knowledge and networks would enrich the empire in ways no conquest could. This act of tolerance was both principled and pragmatic. Bayezid understood that the strength of the Ottoman Empire lay in its mosaic of cultures, religions, and languages. Under his rule, Muslims, Christians, and Jews coexisted in relative harmony, bound not by uniformity but by a shared civic order. This pluralism became a defining feature of Ottoman identity, a vast empire where difference was not erased but managed with care. Bayezid also strengthened maritime power, recognizing the growing threat of European naval empires. He invested in shipbuilding and coastal fortifications, extending Ottoman influence into the Black Sea and maintaining pressure on Venice and Genoa. Though the Ottoman navy had not yet reached its peak, under Bayezid, the foundation for future dominance at sea was laid. Yet, despite his aversion to large-scale warfare, Bayezid was not without military engagements. Skirmishes continued with the Mamluks, the Hungarians, and rebellious vassals in the Balkans. His strategy, however, leaned more toward diplomacy backed by threat than open conquest. Treaties, tribute arrangements, and marriages were his preferred tools, allowing him to maintain the empire's borders without draining its resources. Internally, Bayezid prioritized economic stability. He reformed the tax system, cracked down on corruption, and sought to standardize coinage to prevent inflation. Markets flourished, artisans thrived, and trade networks stretched from North Africa to Persia. Istanbul became a cosmopolitan hub where goods, ideas, and people crossed paths in the shadow of soaring minarets and bustling bazaars. Culturally, the reign of Bayezid II witnessed a flowering of the arts. Calligraphy, miniature painting, and music flourished in his court. Scholars debated theology, astronomy, and medicine in madrasas built with the Sultan's patronage. Poetry in Persian and Turkish adorned the libraries, while architectural projects reflected a maturing imperial aesthetic, grander yet more refined than the brutal grandeur of Mehmed's era. Despite his achievements, dissent simmered. Conservative elements viewed his tolerance with suspicion. Military factions, particularly among the Janissaries, grew restless in the absence of war. The rise of the Safavid dynasty in Persia, championing Sharia Islam, posed a growing ideological and territorial threat in the east. Though Bayezid avoided direct conflict with the Safavids, the tension foreshadowed greater clashes to come. In his later years, age and fatigue began to weigh upon him. Calls for renewed expansion, especially among the army, clashed with his desire for stability. Eventually, internal pressure mounted, and in 1512, Bayezid was forced to abdicate in favor of his son Selim. He retired to the outskirts of the empire and died shortly thereafter, leaving behind a realm richer, more stable, and more unified than when he had found it. Bayezid II may not have carved new kingdoms or stormed ancient citadels, but his legacy was no less profound. He demonstrated that an empire need not always expand to grow, that diplomacy, diversity, and balance could be just as powerful as cannons and cavalry. He gave the Ottomans breath after the storm, a time to root themselves deeply in the lands they had conquered. And in doing so, he gave them the strength they would need for the tempest to come. Chapter 9. Selim the Grim, Blood, Fire, and the Shadow of Empire. In 1512, the Ottoman Empire passed into the hands of Selim I, a man whose reputation would soon eclipse even the most hardened rulers of his dynasty. Nicknamed Yavuz, meaning the Grim, Selim was as feared as he was unyielding. Where his father Bayezid had ruled through diplomacy and moderation, Selim's approach was unapologetically brutal. His reign would last only 8 years, but in that short span he would double the size of the empire, shift the axis of the Islamic world, and etch his name into history with the blade of revolution. Selim's path to the throne was not peaceful. He seized power through a swift and violent coup, forcing his father into abdication and eliminating his brothers to secure his claim. This ruthlessness was not out of malice, it was a calculated strategy. Selim believed the Ottoman Empire stood on a precipice, surrounded by threats internal and external. To preserve it, he would not compromise. His first target lay to the east, the Safavid Empire of Persia. The Safavids, under Shah Ismail I, had introduced a potent blend of Sharia ideology and military expansionism. Their influence was spreading into Anatolia, stirring dissent among Turkic tribes and challenging Ottoman religious authority. Selim regarded this not just as political defiance, but as heresy. He rallied his forces under the banner of Sunni orthodoxy, framing the coming war as both a holy struggle and an existential necessity. In 1514, the two empires collided at the Battle of Calderon. Selim's troops, disciplined and equipped with firearms and artillery, faced the more flamboyant cavalry of the Safavids. It was a massacre. The Safavid forces were decimated, Shah Ismail fled the field, and the myth of his invincibility was shattered. The Ottomans marched into Tabriz, the Persian capital, though they did not hold it. Calderon marked not just a military victory, but a turning point in Islamic geopolitics. The Ottomans had declared themselves the sword-bearers of Sunni Islam. With the eastern frontier secured, Selim turned south. His next target was the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, one of the oldest and most prestigious Muslim powers, and the guardian of Islam's holiest cities. Mecca and Medina. The Mamluks were respected and seasoned, but Selim moved with terrifying speed. In 1516, he annihilated their forces at the Battle of Marj Dabik near Aleppo. The following year, at the Battle of Radania near Cairo, he delivered the death blow. The conquest of Egypt was not merely a territorial gain, it was a cosmic transformation of the Islamic world. With the capture of Cairo, Selim also acquired symbolic supremacy. The Abbasid Caliphate, long exiled in Mamluk custody, was transferred to Ottoman hands. The holy cities of Mecca and Medina submitted to Selim's authority. For the first time, the Ottoman Sultan also bore the title of Caliph, commander of the faithful. This unification of religious and temporal power elevated the Ottomans beyond empire. They were now the spiritual leaders of the Sunni Muslim world. The reverberations were immense. Across Islamic lands, Selim was both feared and revered. His dominions stretched from the Danube to the Nile, from the Tigris to the Hijaz. The Red Sea and much of the eastern Mediterranean now lay beneath the Ottoman crescent. Yet Selim's reign was not only about conquest. He understood the machinery of empire. In Egypt, he preserved the administrative framework of the Mamluks, allowing local elites to maintain influence under Ottoman supervision. This strategy of calculated tolerance maintained stability and ensured a smoother transition of power. Caravans continued to flow, pilgrimage routes were protected, and trade flourished along the old arteries of empire. Selim also prioritized maritime strength. Though he did not live to see the full blossoming of Ottoman naval supremacy, he invested heavily in shipyards, coastal defenses, and fleet mobilization. These efforts would later bear fruit under his successors, enabling the Ottomans to challenge Portuguese influence in the Indian Ocean and dominate Mediterranean trade routes. But Selim ruled with a shadow. His court was austere, his policies severe, and his methods often merciless. Tales circulated of his quick temper and icy discipline. He tolerated no rebellion, no dissent, and no deviation from his vision. Where others negotiated, Selim silenced. His rule was like a sword unsheathed, brilliant, sharp, and dangerous to touch. In 1520, Selim died unexpectedly, likely of illness, while preparing for another campaign. The news of his death sent a tremor through the empire. The world had grown accustomed to his iron grip. Yet what he left behind was astonishing. A realm that had nearly doubled in size, an empire now the epicenter of Sunni Islam, and a legacy of centralization, strength, and purpose. Selim the Grim ruled not with subtlety, but with certainty. He believed the world was a battlefield between truth and threat, and he acted accordingly. He set the stage for the most glorious chapter in Ottoman history, not by building with patience, but by carving with force. And in doing so, he passed a sharpened sword to a son who would wield it with brilliance. His name was Suleiman. The world would soon know him as the Magnificent. Chapter 10. Suleiman the Magnificent, Empire of Laws and Glory. In 1520, upon the death of Selim the Grim, the throne passed to his only surviving son, Suleiman. He was 26 years old, and already whispers had begun. Could this quiet, well-read young man fill the void left by his ferocious father? Few could have foreseen what was coming. For under Suleiman's hand, the Ottoman Empire would not merely expand, it would ascend. This was not just a reign, it was an era. And history would remember him by two names, Kanuni, the Lawgiver, and the Magnificent. Suleiman inherited a realm vast and vibrating with momentum. His first years were marked by immediate, sweeping campaigns. In 1521, he captured Belgrade, the key to Central Europe, a fortress long considered impenetrable. The next year, he took Rhodes from the Knights Hospitaller after a brutal siege, removing a lingering Christian foothold in the eastern Mediterranean. These victories were more than territorial, they were psychological blows to Europe's pride. But it was the Battle of Mohacs in 1526 that would become a defining moment of his reign. Facing the Kingdom of Hungary, one of the last major Christian powers resisting Ottoman encroachment, Suleiman's forces overwhelmed the Hungarian army in a single afternoon. The king perished, the nobility was shattered, and Hungary crumbled into Ottoman hands. For a time, it seemed there was no force in Europe that could halt the Ottoman tide. Emboldened, Suleiman advanced on Vienna in 1529, the imperial capital of the Habsburg dynasty. The siege failed, not for lack of will, but for rain, mud, and logistics. Yet even in retreat, the message was clear. The Ottomans were no longer merely knocking at Europe's door, they were demanding a seat at its table. But Suleiman was no mere general. He was a statesman, a poet, a scholar of Islamic jurisprudence. While his armies expanded the frontier, he worked tirelessly to refine the empire's inner workings. He issued a sweeping codification of civil and criminal law, the canon. For the first time, imperial statutes were systematically compiled alongside Islamic Sharia, offering consistency across a realm that stretched from Algiers to Baghdad. In this order, diversity found structure. His court was a masterpiece of ceremony and governance. Viziers, scribes, judges, and ambassadors gathered beneath the domes of Topkapi Palace, their functions orchestrated like a symphony. The Devshirme system reached its mature form, and the Janissary Corps, loyal only to the Sultan, stood as both sword and shield of imperial authority. Under Suleiman's patronage, culture bloomed. The architect Mimar Sinan, once a Janissary engineer, rose to become the empire's master builder. He erected mosques and bridges that still defy time. The Suleimani Mosque in Istanbul remains a crown of Ottoman architecture, a soaring blend of divine geometry and human ambition. Painters, calligraphers, and musicians filled the court. The Ottomans did not merely build power, they cultivated beauty. And within this golden court walked a woman who would redefine Ottoman politics. Hürrem Sultan, known in the West as Roxolana. Once a concubine, she became Suleiman's legal wife and closest confidant. Her rise was unprecedented. She advised the Sultan, patronized charitable works, and maneuvered the royal succession through her sons. Their love story defied convention and rewrote the nature of Ottoman dynastic power. While Suleiman's court refined the empire's inner world, its outer reach continued to grow. In North Africa, Ottoman fleets clashed with the Spanish and Portuguese, bringing Algiers and Tunis into the imperial fold. In the east, the Safavids of Persia were checked repeatedly, their expansionism blunted by Ottoman campaigns. In the Indian Ocean, the empire supported Muslim states against Portuguese encroachment, signaling that the Ottomans saw themselves not just as regional rulers, but global defenders of Islam. At sea, Suleiman's navy became legendary under the command of Hayreddin Barbarossa. The Mediterranean, once a Christian lake, shifted into Ottoman dominance. The Battle of Preveza in 1538 confirmed this, crippling the Holy League's fleet and ensuring Ottoman supremacy at sea for decades to come. Yet Suleiman's reign was not without strain. The further the empire expanded, the more complex its administration became. Distant provinces struggled with corruption. Revolts simmered in Yemen and North Africa. And as Suleiman aged, the question of succession darkened the imperial horizon. Tragedy struck when he ordered the execution of his own son, Mustafa, suspecting rebellion. The decision would haunt the court and leave scars on the dynasty. In 1566, at the age of 71, the old lion embarked on one final campaign against the fortress of Sijitvar in Hungary. He died in his tent before the battle concluded, his death concealed from the army until victory was secured. It was a fitting end for a sultan who had lived and ruled in rhythm with conquest. Suleiman the Magnificent left behind an empire at its zenith, territorially vast, administratively sophisticated, culturally radiant. He had expanded the empire to its greatest geographical extent. He had reformed its laws, reshaped its courts, and redefined its identity. And though time would bring decline, his reign remained the summit from which all else would be measured. In life, he was emperor and poet. In death, he became myth. The tomb of Suleiman lies in Istanbul, beside the mosque that bears his name, overlooking the city he adorned with splendor. There, beneath stone and script, rests the man who held the world in balance and dared to make it magnificent. Chapter 11: Naval Power and the Mediterranean Struggle. As the 16th century matured, so too did the Ottoman Empire's ambitions. No longer confined to the land, the Sultan's shadow now reached over the sea. Under Suleiman the Magnificent, Ottoman naval power had risen to dominate the eastern Mediterranean. But after his death in 1566, the struggle for maritime supremacy intensified. The waves, once conduits of commerce and conquest, became battlefields where the fate of empires would be written in fire and salt. At the heart of the Ottoman navy stood the formidable legacy of Hayreddin Barbarossa, the corsair-turned-admiral whose victories had once terrorized Christian fleets. Though Barbarossa had died in 1546, his naval doctrine lived on, a blend of state-sponsored piracy, disciplined fleet maneuvers, and strategic control of island outposts. Ottoman ships patrolled from Algiers to Rhodes, from Tunis to the Adriatic, ensuring trade flowed and enemies were kept at bay. But the Mediterranean was not an Ottoman lake. Spain, under Philip II, the Papal States, and the Republic of Venice had formed a growing alliance, the Holy League, dedicated to pushing back Ottoman dominance. In the western waters, clashes were frequent, brutal, and often inconclusive. Commerce raiders battled privateers, and each port seized or lost could tilt the balance of power. Tensions reached their crescendo in 1571 with the Battle of Lepanto, a naval confrontation that would come to symbolize the high-water mark of Christian resistance. The Ottoman fleet under Muezzin Zaid Ali Pasha met the Holy League's armada, commanded by Don John of Austria, off the coast of western Greece. The air was thick with prophecy and fury. When the cannons ceased and the smoke lifted, over 30,000 men lay dead, and nearly 200 Ottoman ships were lost or captured. It was the first major defeat of the Ottoman navy. Shocking, staggering, and deeply symbolic. Yet the empire's response was swift and stunning. Within a year, the Ottomans rebuilt their fleet almost entirely. Shipyards from Gallipoli to Istanbul rang with the sound of hammers and the hiss of steaming timbers. The new armada set sail with renewed purpose, reclaiming lost ground, and capturing Tunis in 1574. Though Lepanto bruised Ottoman pride, it did not cripple its capacity. The empire remained a dominant maritime force for decades to come. Beyond warships and sea battles, the Ottoman grip on the Mediterranean was enforced through a complex web of island garrisons, fortified ports, and protected trade routes. Cyprus, conquered from Venice in 1571, became a crucial outpost. Crete and the Dodecanese were watched carefully, while coastal cities like Tripoli and Beirut served as naval supply hubs and defensive bulwarks. The navy was more than a military tool, it was a political instrument. Control of the seas meant control over pilgrim routes to Mecca, over spice and silk traffic from the east, and over the flow of tribute from North Africa. The Grand Admiral, or Capitan Pasha, became one of the most powerful figures in the empire, often a close confidant of the Sultan and a skilled statesman in his own right. Naval schools flourished. Cartographers, such as Piri Reis, produced exquisite maritime maps that fused Islamic science with European techniques. His famous Book of Navigation, rich in detail and artistry, showed not only coastlines but the Ottoman desire to master the seas through knowledge as much as force. Still, the challenges of maritime rule were many. The western Mediterranean remained contested by Spanish and Portuguese powers. North African provinces, while loyal in name, often acted autonomously. Barbary corsairs sometimes defied imperial orders, their loyalty shifting with gold and opportunity. The empire's maritime frontier was not a wall. It was a tide, always in motion. By the early 17th century, the focus of imperial ambition began to shift inland once again. The navy, while still respected, received less attention from the court. Funds were increasingly directed toward Eastern campaigns, and naval innovations lagged behind European advances. The empire's inability to decisively dominate the Mediterranean in the long term began to show. Venice and Spain recovered, while Dutch and English ships appeared with increasing frequency, challenging Ottoman trade dominance. Yet despite these emerging threats, the Ottomans remained a major naval power. Their control over key choke points, the Dardanelles, the Bosphorus, the Suez, gave them leverage over world trade and diplomacy. Their fleet, though no longer invincible, remained formidable, a black silhouette on the horizon that few dared to provoke without consequence. The age of Ottoman maritime supremacy was a dance of dominance and resistance, of storm-racked battles and delicate diplomacy. The empire's trident may have dulled over time, but its impression remained etched across the Mediterranean basin. Fortresses stood on islands like stone sentinels of memory. Sea charts bore the crescent's curve, and in the hearts of those who crossed those waters, the name of the Sultan still echoed with power. As the empire began to look inward and eastward once more, the sea remained, a reflection of past glory, and a reminder that the Ottoman dream had not only marched on land, but had once sailed with thunder over the deep. Chapter 12. The Sultanate of Women Power Behind the Veil. As the golden glow of Suleiman's reign faded into twilight, the Ottoman court underwent a quiet, yet profound transformation. One that unfolded not in the heat of battlefields, but behind the latticed windows of the imperial harem. From the mid-16th to the late 17th century, a unique era emerged in which women of the Sultan's household, mothers, consorts, and concubines, exercised unprecedented influence over state affairs. Historians would come to call it Kadınlar Saltanati, the Sultanate of Women. The roots of this transformation lay in Suleiman's own life. His deep bond with Hurrem Sultan had broken Ottoman tradition. Where previous sultans had avoided formal marriage to maintain dynastic flexibility, Suleiman had wed Hurrem and allowed her to reside permanently in the capital. Her influence in court affairs, philanthropic works, and succession planning set a new precedent. The harem was no longer a private refuge, it had become a political theater. Upon Suleiman's death, Hurrem's legacy lived on through her son, Selim II, and successive sultans who came to power young or uninterested in governance. Into this vacuum stepped the Valide Sultan, the sultan's mother, whose authority over the harem, and, increasingly, over the empire, became official and immense. The Valide Sultan commanded vast wealth, controlled the imperial household, and often acted as a key advisor or regent to her son. One of the most formidable Valide sultans was Kösem, who rose to power during the early 17th century. Widowed by Sultan Ahmed I, she ruled through her sons Murad IV and Ibrahim, and even her grandson Mehmed IV. For decades, she was the true power behind the throne. Known for her intelligence, political cunning, and massive patronage networks, Kösem navigated palace intrigue, janissary rebellions, and religious tensions with cold precision. Her influence was so dominant that she effectively acted as sovereign in all but name. Yet power rarely comes without peril. The harem became a hotbed of factionalism. Concubines aligned with viziers, eunuchs acted as brokers between rival courts, and the line between domestic space and imperial court blurred. Poisonings, secret executions, and conspiracies became commonplace. The palace, once a fortress of imperial order, echoed with whispers, schemes, and ambition cloaked in silk. At times, the Sultan himself became a pawn. Some were mere children when crowned. Others, like Ibrahim I, were mentally unstable and manipulated by those around them. In these moments, the Valide Sultan or the chief consort would become de facto rulers, issuing edicts, influencing appointments, and managing foreign diplomacy. While some historians have criticized this period as one of decline, others recognize it as a testament to the resilience of Ottoman institutions. Even when the throne wavered, the state endured. The architectural footprint of these powerful women remains visible even today. They commissioned grand mosques, fountains, schools, and soup kitchens. Hurrem Sultan's Haseki complex, Nurbanu Sultan's Attic Valide Mosque, and Kozum Sultan's charitable endowments transformed Istanbul's skyline and social fabric. These acts of public service were more than charity. They were declarations of legitimacy, morality, and authority. Not all in the empire welcomed this feminine ascendancy. Religious scholars and conservative elites decried the erosion of traditional gender hierarchies. The Janissaries, growing more unpredictable, resented harem influence on military and administrative decisions. And among the populace, rumors and satire swirled, stories of seductive manipulation, lavish excess, and unseen hands guiding the empire's fate. Still, the Sultanate of Women was not a monolith. Each woman brought her own character and methods. Nurbanu Sultan, mother of Murad III, was a skilled diplomat, liaising with Venetian emissaries. Turhan Hadisi Sultan, who ultimately had Kozum murdered, ushered in the construction of the Yeni Mosque and ruled alongside her son with stern resolve. These women were not merely manipulators. They were governors in a veiled empire, ruling through ritual, kinship, and presence. Eventually, the balance shifted. As sultans began to assert more direct control, the influence of the harem waned. Mehmed IV, though crowned young, grew into a capable ruler who curbed the reach of palace factions. Viziers like Koprulu Mehmed Pasha assumed executive power, re-establishing the authority of the Sublime Porte. The age of the Sultanate of Women, while not abruptly ended, quietly receded. Yet its legacy remained. The very fact that women had once governed from behind curtains, influencing war, law, and diplomacy, challenged the assumptions of empire. It revealed the Ottoman state not as a rigid autocracy, but a living organism capable of adaptation, survival, and even reinvention when faced with unusual circumstances. The Sultanate of Women was not a rupture, but a revelation. In its shadowed halls and whispered decisions, the Ottoman Empire discovered a new way to wield power, subtle, strategic, and often maternal. And though the veils would eventually fall, their imprint remained, woven into the architecture, memory, and blood of the empire they helped sustain. Chapter 13. Crisis and Reform, from Decline to Tanzimat. By the dawn of the 18th century, the Ottoman Empire stood at a crossroads, no longer the unstoppable force that had once shaken Vienna's walls, yet still a sprawling dominion straddling continents. Its armies marched, its courts still ruled, and its markets still thrived. But the once seamless machinery of empire had begun to creak. A slow erosion of discipline, economic imbalance, and external pressure signaled that the empire was entering a prolonged struggle not against a single enemy, but against the weight of time itself. The 17th century had already planted the seeds of difficulty. The Janissaries, once the backbone of Ottoman military might, had grown corrupt and unmanageable. Their allegiance, once sworn to the Sultan, increasingly shifted toward their own ranks, demanding pensions, meddling in court politics, and resisting reform. Rebellions became more frequent, and palace coups, often backed by military factions, shattered the once unshakable authority of the sultans. Economically, the empire was feeling the strain of global shifts. The age of exploration had rerouted trade around the Cape of Good Hope, bypassing the land routes once controlled by the Ottomans. Silver from the New World flooded into Europe, devaluing the Ottoman currency and destabilizing the Timar system that had once linked land, military service, and governance. Inflation soared, peasants suffered, and corruption seeped deeper into the provinces. Externally, the empire's borders began to buckle. The Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 marked the first major territorial concession to European powers, a moment of sobering realization. Hungary slipped from Ottoman hands, and the Habsburgs, Russians, and Safavids circled like wolves sensing weakness. The empire, once the hammer of Christendom, now found itself on the defensive. Yet even in decline, the Ottomans did not collapse. They adapted. The 18th century saw a series of cautious attempts at modernization, often piecemeal, sometimes reactionary, but earnest in their desire to preserve the empire's vitality. One such moment came during the Tulip era, 1718 to 1730, a brief period of cultural renaissance under Sultan Ahmed III. Inspired by European elegance and courtly arts, this era saw the proliferation of gardens, poetry, and architecture, but it also introduced the empire's first official printing press and tentative diplomatic exchanges with France and Austria. Still, conservative backlash followed. The Janissaries, religious scholars, and provincial notables resisted these changes, viewing them as corrupting influences. The Patrona Halil rebellion in 1730, sparked by populist anger and Janissary agitation, brought an abrupt end to the Tulip era. Reform had become a dangerous path, necessary for survival yet fraught with peril. Despite this, a series of determined sultans and grand viziers continued to push for renewal. Sultan Selim III, 1789 to 1807, introduced the Nizam-i-Sedid, or New Order, a modernized army trained along European lines. Schools were established, embassies opened, and military factories constructed. But these efforts were undermined by entrenched interests. Selim was eventually deposed and murdered, a victim of the very institutions he sought to reform. It wasn't until the reign of Mahmud II, 1808 to 1839, that reforms gained momentum. Realizing that the Janissaries were beyond salvation, Mahmud took a radical step. In 1826, he ordered their extermination in what became known as the Auspicious Incident. Cannons thundered through the barracks of Istanbul as the core was wiped out, a brutal but transformative act. With the Janissaries gone, the path to restructuring the military, administration, and education was clear. Mahmud's vision laid the foundation for the Tanzimat reforms, officially launched in 1839 under Sultan Abdülmecid I. The Tanzimat Fermani, or Edict of Gulhane, proclaimed sweeping changes. The standardization of taxation, the equality of all imperial subjects under the law regardless of religion, and the promise of a fair judicial process. It was a bold reimagining of imperial citizenship, moving away from the millet system toward a more secular and centralized identity. New ministries were formed. Modern universities and academies emerged. Legal codes were drawn from French civil law. Ottoman provinces were reorganized to reflect European-style governance, with greater central oversight. Infrastructure projects expanded, including railroads, telegraph lines, and modern ports. The empire was trying not only to catch up with Europe, but to prevent itself from being devoured by it. Yet the Tanzimat reforms were not universally embraced. Muslim conservatives saw them as a betrayal of Islamic principles. Non-Muslim minorities, though promised equality, often felt the reforms served imperial centralization rather than true pluralism. The bureaucracy ballooned, and corruption persisted. Still, the Tanzimat marked a vital pivot point. The empire was no longer defending its traditions at all costs. It was reinventing them to survive. By the mid-19th century, the Ottoman Empire was a paradox. Modernizing and stagnating, centralized yet fragmented, reformed but not transformed. Wars with Russia, uprisings in the Balkans, and European economic domination tested the empire's resilience. But through it all, the Ottomans refused to vanish. They endured, not as relics of a forgotten past, but as architects of a complicated and fragile future. The crisis of the empire had not been one of collapse, but of evolution under fire. And in the embers of reform, the Ottomans prepared for their final century, a century that would test the very soul of their identity. The age of sultans and viziers was not over yet, but the world around them was changing fast. And soon, the empire would face its greatest challenge: nationalism. Chapter 14: Nationalism and the Balkan Breakaway. As the 19th century advanced, the Ottoman Empire found itself increasingly surrounded not only by rival empires, but by new and dangerous ideas. Among the most disruptive was nationalism, a force invisible yet explosive, stirring ancient identities and dormant grievances across the empire's multicultural terrain. Nowhere did this idea take root more fiercely than in the Balkans, where centuries of Ottoman rule collided with a growing hunger for self-determination. The age of imperial tolerance gave way to the age of fragmentation. The Balkans had always been the empire's most diverse and volatile frontier. Greeks, Serbs, Bulgarians, Albanians, Bosniaks, Romanians, and others lived among each other, often governed with relative autonomy under the millet system. Religion had long served as the primary identity marker, with the Orthodox Church mediating between the state and Christian subjects. But in the 19th century, that began to shift. Language, ethnicity, and culture rose to the forefront, fueled by foreign ideologies, European romanticism, and local resentment of Ottoman misrule. The spark came from the West. Inspired by the French Revolution and supported by European powers, Greek intellectuals began to imagine a rebirth of Hellenic glory. In 1821, the Greek War of Independence erupted, at first a disorganized revolt, but one that rapidly gained momentum. The Ottomans responded with severity, but Europe, captivated by romanticized visions of classical Greece, intervened. In 1827, a joint British, French, and Russian fleet destroyed the Ottoman navy at the Battle of Navarino, and by 1830, Greece emerged as an independent kingdom. It was a shattering moment. For the first time, a Christian subject people had permanently broken away, with the explicit backing of Europe. The old Ottoman order, built on flexible administration and religious pluralism, was now exposed to a new threat, a world increasingly defined by nation-states, not empires. And the Balkan cauldron, long simmering, began to boil. Serbia soon followed. Led by nationalist leaders like Karađorđe and Miloš Obrenović, the Serbs fought multiple uprisings throughout the early 19th century. Though crushed at times, they gained increasing autonomy. By 1867, Ottoman garrisons had withdrawn entirely, and Serbia operated as a de facto independent state. In 1878, at the Congress of Berlin, Serbia's independence was formally recognized, along with Montenegro and Romania. Each breakaway created a precedent. Each success inspired another uprising, and each loss weakened Ottoman morale and control. Bulgarians, emboldened by the spread of literacy, church independence, and nationalist propaganda, launched their own revolt in 1876. The suppression was brutal, thousands were killed, drawing international outrage. Russia, cast as the defender of Slavs and Orthodox Christians, declared war. The Russo-Turkish War of 1877–78 was swift and devastating. Russian troops marched deep into Ottoman territory, reaching the gates of Istanbul. The Treaty of San Stefano nearly dismembered the empire, creating a massive autonomous Bulgaria and reducing Ottoman power in Europe to a thread. Though the treaty was later modified at the Congress of Berlin under British pressure, the damage was done. The empire had been exposed as vulnerable, its armies outmatched, its unity unraveling. Amid these losses, the Ottomans attempted to reframe their identity. Sultan Abdülhamid II, who took power in 1876, suspended the constitution and dissolved parliament, declaring himself the absolute protector of Islam. He turned to pan-Islamism, hoping to unify Muslims across the empire under a religious banner that could resist ethnic fragmentation. Mosques were built, religious schools expanded, and the caliphate emphasized like never before. But the appeal was limited. In the Balkans, nationalism had already taken hold, and it would not be subdued by prayer. Meanwhile, European interference deepened. Britain occupied Egypt in 1882, claiming to protect trade routes and political stability. Austria-Hungary annexed Bosnia in 1908. Russia continued to fund nationalist movements. The empire, once feared as the sick man of Europe, now became a pawn in a larger game of imperial chess. The Ottomans were not merely fighting their own people, they were fighting Europe itself, dressed in the clothes of revolution. Within the empire, dissent festered. Armenians in eastern Anatolia began to organize around nationalist causes, demanding reforms and protection from local abuses. Kurds, Albanians, and Arabs, all once loyal servants of the empire, grew restless. Each group saw their own future beyond Ottoman authority. In this growing unrest, the empire responded with a mix of repression and reform, granting some rights while crushing dissent elsewhere. But nationalism was no longer a passing storm, it had become a new climate. And in this atmosphere, the Ottoman state, stretched across dozens of languages, faiths, and geographies, could not keep pace, could no longer rely on flexible frontiers or religious accommodation. The dream of empire, one people ruling many, was crumbling in the face of a world that now demanded borders, homelands, and singular identities. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Ottoman map had changed dramatically. Its hold on Europe had shrunk to a sliver of Thrace. The Balkans were gone, claimed by independent states forged in fire, dreams, and rebellion. The empire had survived, but it had been scarred. And as new ideologies took hold in Istanbul itself, the next phase of Ottoman history would not be about defending distant provinces. It would be about saving its very soul. Chapter 15: Collapse and Legacy, From Empire to Republic. By the early 20th century, the Ottoman Empire was a wounded giant, its limbs severed in the Balkans, its chest crushed by European powers, and its heart pierced by internal dissent. Once the pride of Eurasia, the empire now drifted in a fog of instability and desperation. Its rulers scrambled to modernize, reform, and centralize power, but the foundations were crumbling. The last chapter of the Ottoman saga would be one of tragic grandeur, a final struggle against the current of history itself. The first tremors came from within. In 1908, the Young Turk Revolution erupted. Led by reformist officers and intellectuals within the Committee of Union and Progress (CUP), the movement sought to restore the suspended constitution of 1876 and limit the autocratic power of Sultan Abdülhamid II. They succeeded. A brief period of hope bloomed, the Second Constitutional Era, bringing promises of freedom, equality, and parliamentary rule. But the optimism quickly faded. Nationalist tensions sharpened. Ethnic minorities grew disillusioned when Turkish centralization replaced Ottoman pluralism. In 1909, after a failed countercoup, Sultan Abdülhamid was deposed, and Mehmed V, a ceremonial figurehead, took the throne. Real power now resided with the CUP's triumvirate, Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Cemal Pasha, leaders who would steer the empire through its darkest years. In 1912 and 1913, the Balkan Wars delivered a devastating blow. The empire lost nearly all of its remaining European territories in rapid succession: Kosovo, Macedonia, Albania, and most of Thrace. The dream of a multi-ethnic empire was slipping away, replaced by an increasingly desperate and nationalist core. Istanbul remained Ottoman, but only barely. Then came the Great War. In 1914, the Ottomans entered World War I on the side of the Central Powers, led by Enver Pasha's strategic gamble to align with Germany. The empire hoped to regain lost lands and revive its power. Instead, it was plunged into catastrophe. On multiple fronts, from the Caucasus to Mesopotamia, from Gallipoli to the Sinai, Ottoman soldiers fought, bled, and died in staggering numbers. One of the darkest stains in this final chapter came in 1915 with the Armenian genocide. In the shadow of war and rebellion, the Ottoman government orchestrated the mass deportation and extermination of Armenians, a tragedy that would claim over 1 million lives and leave a legacy of pain, denial, and international condemnation. The empire's pluralistic soul, already fragile, was shattered completely. Though the Ottomans achieved symbolic victories, such as halting the Allied invasion at Gallipoli, they were overwhelmed elsewhere. British-led campaigns in Arabia, aided by Arab tribal uprisings and figures like T. Lawrence, stripped the Ottomans of their southern provinces. Baghdad, Jerusalem, and Damascus fell. The Ottoman dream of leading the Islamic world, once realized under Selim and Suleiman, was now broken on desert sands. By 1918, the empire had collapsed in all but name. Sultan Mehmed VI, now a puppet monarch, signed the Armistice of Mudros, effectively ending Ottoman participation in the war. British, French, Italian, and Greek forces occupied large swaths of Anatolia and Istanbul itself. The Treaty of Sèvres in 1920 proposed a complete dismemberment of the empire, leaving only a rump Turkish state. It was an imperial death sentence. But in the heart of Anatolia, resistance stirred. A former Ottoman officer, Mustafa Kemal, rejected the treaty, denounced the Sultan's compliance, and began organizing nationalist forces. In 1919, from the Black Sea town of Samsun, he launched the Turkish War of Independence. Over the next 3 years, his movement, rooted in secularism, nationalism, and modernism, drove out occupying armies, dismantled the remnants of the old regime, and captured the imagination of a people seeking rebirth. By 1922, the Sultanate was abolished. Mehmed VI fled Istanbul aboard a British warship, the last Ottoman ruler departing in silence and disgrace. The Caliphate, briefly preserved, was abolished in 1924. The Ottoman Empire, after more than 600 years of glory, terror, beauty, and contradiction, was gone. In its place rose the Republic of Turkey. Mustafa Kemal, soon to be known as Ataturk, rejected the imperial past. He banned the fez, introduced the Latin alphabet, granted rights to women, and turned mosques into museums. He did not want to reform the empire. He wanted to bury it. And yet, the Ottoman shadow lingered in the cityscapes, in the architecture, in the legal codes, in the very soul of its successor. The legacy of the Ottoman Empire is one of grandeur and tragedy. It was a realm that fused East and West, that governed Christians, Muslims, and Jews in an age of absolute rule. It built mosques that kissed the heavens, courts that balanced Sharia and state, and a navy that ruled the tides. It was a crucible of cultures, a force of war, a center of art, and a paradox of tolerance and tyranny. Empires rise and fall, but few leave footprints as vast as the Ottomans. From the Euphrates to the Danube, from the gates of Vienna to the sands of Arabia, their story is carved into stone, whispered in prayer, and inked in the archives of kings and revolutionaries alike. The empire may have fallen, but its echoes remain.